Shalom, shalom, and welcome this morning to the Ways of Israel. And as promised, we are going to start this morning with the series of Sefer Ha-Ikkarim of Rabbi Joseph Albo. So we're going to go in the next 2 days with the introduction. It is a little bit lengthy, but it's very important to understand who this rabbi was and the accomplishments and the great head that he had, and basically where he perhaps differentiated from a lot of his other predecessors like the Rambam and so forth. So it becomes very, very important in this whole entire discussion or conversation that we're going to have over Sefer Ha-Ikkarim. So let's go ahead and get started. Those of you who would like to be able to support our effort are invited to join us at the Ways of Israel and give whatever you can in tzedakah through our through our PayPal account or Zelle. You could send whatever donation you would like to my Zelle account, which is rabbiotero@yahoo.com, or directly through PayPal here linked up underneath or next to the video. So let's get started here this morning. Let me just woke up a little bit, you might say, under the weather. So let's get started here. We're going to take a look here at the Sefer Ha-Ikkarim. Those of you who would like to have a copy of the Sefer by PDF, please let me know. It is public information, but it's very, very good, and just want to let you know that we're going to be looking at Sefer Ha-Ikkarim on the work that was translated from Hebrew to English, which is also available on Sefaria.org. Sefer Ha-Ikkarim is also called the Books of Principles or Fundamentals by Joseph Albo. It was critically edited on the basis of the manuscripts in Old Edition, provided with translation by Isaac Husik, who has a Master's of Art and PhD. He's also a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. And so we're going to read a little bit of the information he provides. On the 26th of November, 1412, the anti-pope Benedict XIII, also known as Pedro de Luna, sent a letter from Tortosa to the Jewish community of Gerona, which read in part as follows: "Being obliged by the bond of charity which constrains us, and the duty of our office to work with all our strength to procure the salvation of the souls of all believers and unbelievers. Therefore we order," fascinating. You'll see this very typical, that we order, in other words, for the benefit, the good for all, right? We order. I have to laugh because it's so similar in today's world. Being obliged by the bond of charity which constrains us, and by duty of our office to work with all strength to procure the salvation of souls of all believers and unbelievers. Therefore, we order and exhort that you send 4 or at least 2 of your most learned men, versed in the laws of Moses. These men shall appear before us at a time indicated here or elsewhere, wherever we may be located in the states of our very dear Son of Christ, King Ferdinand of Aragon, to hear what we shall say in reply to the above mentioned articles. You must not forget that if you will not obey our injunctions, we will proceed against you effectively by means of the proper remedies as prescribed by the laws, human as well as divine, Similar letters were sent to other Jewish community in the kingdom of Aragon. So first of all, we'll see there's this whole entire dialogue and this whole edict to appear before the courts of anti-Pope Benedict was something very, very manipulative, with the whole idea to show how true Christianity was all about. Excuse me. On January 1413, and therefore thereafter, the delegates of the Jewish community arrived at Tortosa. Spokesman for the Pope was Jerome de Santa Fide, the physician of the Pope Benedict XIII, a converted Jew. You can see that there was a lot of converted Jews in the Catholic faith during that time, whose Hebrew name was, in other words, he's not going by his Hebrew name anymore, but whose Hebrew name was Joshua ben Joseph Ibn Vives HaLorki, and the author of a treatise in Hebrew entitled Sefer Ha-Ikkarim. We may take a look at that Sefer later on after we cover this. Defending Christianity and attacking Judaism. A good deal of it is based on the Purgio Fide of Raymond Martini. When the delegates arrived before the Pope, he said to them, Master Jerome says that he desires to prove that the Messiah has come, and that too from the Talmud, which is before you, and we shall see whether he has the truth or not. As for you, you will need to have no fear, for as regards to the controversy, you have equal rights with him. The colloquium or conference was opened on the 7th of February, 1413, with great pomp, and the Pope himself in the presence of the entire Curia, with all the requisites, the formalities to which it's customary to conform on such an occasion, with the solemnity, with the importance and subjects demanded. The debate lasted from the 7th of February, 1413, to the 13th of November. In other words, it was multiple months, to 1414. Altogether, 69 sessions were held, 62 at Tortosa and 7 at San Mateo. And at least 2 sessions were held on the 12th and the 13th of November, 1414. And it was published in the Constitution, or the bull entitled Et Si Doctoris Gentim, against the Talmud and other books attacking Christianity. Jerome, when traveled through the kingdom of Aragon to give effect to the Constitution and confiscate, very key word, confiscate the existing copies of the Talmud. This is what you would call censoring of the freedom of religion. Among the 8 principal spokesmen for the Jews at this debate is mentioned one Joseph Albo of Daroca. The third session, held on the 9th of February, 1413, Jerome cited a passage from the Talmud. This is a famous Talmud passage, and as a matter of fact, it's still being used today by many of the Messianic and Christian leaders to show and to prove. You see, our guy is the one. Sanhedrin 97b, as follows: Elijah said to Rabbi Yehuda, brother of Rabbi Salah, the pious, the world counts no less than 85 jubilees, and the last jubilee, the son of David, will come. Now 85 jubilees, explained Jerome, makes it to 4,250 years. Hence, the Messiah has already come. The Pope agreed with Jerome, whereupon Joseph Albo, with a sort of rage, cried out, Posito messiami mihi probari iam venisi, non putarem diterior esse Judeus. His name is mentioned again as having taken up the defense of the Talmud in the subsequent sessions. The disputation, no doubt, made a strong impression on Albo, and may account for some of the features of Albo's treatise on the dogmas of Judaism, and is also called in Hebrew Sefer Ha-Ikkarim, the Book of Roots or Fundamentals, or Fundamental Principles of the Jewish Faith, which has been very popular among Jews since its appearance in the 15th century. Now keep in mind the disputation took place way before, we're going to take a look at that, but apparently the whole conversation really affected the mindset of Albo. And by the way, the whole entire series of the Sefer Ha-Ikkarim is dedicated to the memory of a descendant of Joseph Albo by the name of George Albo, or YEHUDAN NATAN, a direct descendant of the Albo of Spain, who about a year ago passed away, a good friend of mine. A critical Hebrew text with an English translation and explanatory notes is offered to those of you who wish a copy. Be more than happy to forward it to you. And like I said, it would be a good idea to take the opportunity and also help support our organization. The Ikkarim is the last philosophical and theological classic work of medieval Judaism, belonging to the genre of literary works of Emunot V'Deot of Sadia Gaon and Hababot Lebabot of Bahaya Ibn Pakuda, the Kusari, which is a recommended book to read, the Kusari of Yehuda Halevi, the Emunah Ramah of Abraham Ibn David, the Moreh of Nebuchim of Moses Maimonides, and Milchamot Hashem of Levi ben Gershom, and the Or Hadonai of Hasdai Kreska, who we're going to take a look, had an influence, a very strong influence on the workings of Joseph Albo and other less important works constituting the medieval philosophy of Jews, for a detailed study for which I recommend the viewer to be referred to the present writer, The History of Medieval Jewish Philosophy, published in 1960, and the 18th chapter of the work, which is devoted to the study and philosophy of Joseph Albo. Now, being virtually the last medieval Jewish philosopher, and having no knowledge of the new spirit that was beginning in Italy as a result of the Renaissance, Albo was a contemporary of Georgius Pletho, Georgius Gemistheus Pletho, who was influential in reviving the study of Plato and Neoplatonism, Platonism in the West or Occident. And his pupil, his student, Bessarion, Albo has nothing new to contribute to the genuine philosophic thought. On the other hand, he was very familiar with the work of his predecessor, Sadia Gaon, Yehuda Halevi, Maimonides, Gersonides, Kreska, and summed up the ideas in his Sefer Ha-Ikkarim. So this is what you'll find in his Sefer, very summarized. This is why you read about the 13 principles of Maimonides. Well, you're going to see that Albo reduces them to about 6 of them. In a very popular and a very attractive style in Sefer Ha-Ikkarim, there's a good deal of homily in Albo, and he devotes many pages and chapters to lengthy, and one might be so kind to say, even long-winded interpretation of biblical and rabbinical passages, reading all sorts of metaphysical, ethical, psychological, theological ideas without regard to context, a method sanctioned by long usage which goes back to early rabbinical literature. Albo's interest was, however, primarily concerned with Jewish dogma, which we know really there isn't that much. Maimonides had made a list of 13 principles of the Jewish faith, and Rabbi Hasdai Kreska, the teacher of Albo, found fault with Maimonides and made a list of his own, distinguishing between the fundamental doctrines, which he reduced to 6, and true belief, which he enumerates to 8. Albo followed Kreska's footstep and reduced the basic dogmas to 3: the existence of God, reward and punishment, and revelation. Under these 3, he subsumes the derivative principles, which he enumerates to 8, making it all 11. Albo's classification of law into divine, natural, and conventional, as we will see, seems new in Jewish philosophic writing. Although Maimonides, in the Guide of the Perplexed, chapter 240, makes a distinction between the conventional and the divine law, there is a certain similarity between Albo's classification and that of Thomas Aquino. If we omit the eternal law, both of them, however, make use of the 19th psalm in their discussion of superiority of the divine law to the natural and conventional. Hence, it's possible that in some indirect manner Alba was indebted to the angelic doctor, but one can not be certain of this. It was said before that Alba was much exercised by the aggressive attitude of the church, which attempted by compulsory disputation to force upon the Jews an admission of the truth of Christianity. In other words, it attempted to have Jews say Christianity is the truth. As he had taken part in much of the disputation himself, the question is raised on the occasion that must have haunted his mind. He would expect him to find evidence of this in his work. There are, however, certain discussions in the Ha-Ikkarim or Ikkarim which seems to owe their existence to circumstances that's mentioned. The genuine divine religion, for example, chapter 24 of the same book, raises another question whose narrative and motive is similar to the first. It's permitted to investigate one's religion to see if it's genuine or not, and one is at liberty to abandon it if, on a comparison with another religion, the latter is to be found better. In other words, this is where it becomes the crux of the whole intention of the forced conversation with the Catholic Church. In other words, they were looking at the motive to make sure they can be able to force Jews to convert to Christianity by the arguments that they were going to present. The chapter in the Ikkarim which deals most directly with the conflict between Judaism and Christianity is the 25th chapter in the third book of the Ha-Ikkarim, which is a record of an actual disputation, but hardly that of Tortosa. The ordinary editions omit important portions thereof, and even some of the manuscripts, an early edition, including the first, either deleted portions, cut out entire chapters, and reads, for example, in the Warsaw edition a little bit differently. One can only guess that the opponents of Albo was all a Christian, and as all reference to Christianity has been excised. The criticism of the Mosaic Law have been retained, but the New Testament, which was the opponent, compares the law of Moses to the disadvantage of the latter. It is not mentioned. Only part of the opponent's word is given, and all reference to the gospel is omitted, even when they are cited as being superior to that of the Mosaic Law. It is not surprising, therefore, that Albo's reply, in which he defends the Mosaic Law against strictures of his opponent and points out the superiority of the Pentateuch in imperfection and errors of the New Testament, only his defense and praise of the Mosaic Law are retained, while his criticism of the New Testament is expunged. We understand the reason why for that. Albo shows wide reading and great familiarity with the writings of his predecessors, Jewish and non-Jewish writings equal. He lays under the contribution to the literature not only of philosophy and theology, but also the writing of Kabbalah, science, medicine, and history. He is of a greater compiler, while in many places he names his authorities. He and many others quite negligent of such courtesy, though he borrows whole discussions and analysis in the body from other writers. He's also earned him the challenge of the plagiarism in the medieval period as well as in modern times. In particular, it is his theological work of Magen Avot which is cited in justification of such charges. While he mentioned Kreska once or twice, he should have done so more often and have been more frank in his acknowledgement and his indebtedness to his teacher here. He nevertheless mentions Rabbi Duran. He never mentions Rabbi Duran at all, and yet seems to have borrowed from Mishpat Tzedek, even perhaps from Kreska. Among the non-Jewish writers, he uses Aristotle's idea quite freely, without naming him, as example in his discussion of the love in chapter 35 and 37 of the book, and in book 3. He also is praised, and however mentions such Christian theologians as Hugo Grotius and Richard Simon. The former speaks of him regarding his commentary on Matthew chapter 5 verse 20 as a Judaeum Aserim Judici in his letters on page 14 and page 111. He wishes to express that the Ikkarim should be translated, and Richard Simon praises him in the supplements to the ceremonies of the Jews, page 116. He also mentions that Joseph de Voisin, in his Theologia Judaica in Paris in 1647, page 4, cited by the Ikkarim, and frequently criticizes it. The following translation that we're looking at is the first complete version of the Ikkarim, which first appeared as the basis of this commentary or this study in English. And it's upon the critical text, which is a composite of the first edition of Socino in the 21st of Tevet, which is 1485 or 5246 in the Hebrew year. It's also described below other editions, and I recommend you request a copy. I'll be more than happy to send you this since it's public domain. Be more than happy to provide you a copy of the entire Sefer and its translation. In addition to the editio principle designated in the critical notes of the Hebrew text, as we'll see in different versions. This is also available in the Paris National Library and also the Jewish Theological Seminary in different editions here. While the basic text is a composite of two basic texts labeled as S and A, a lot was departed from by the editor and added some variants in this, as mentioned by consultation by the renowned Talmudist Professor Louis Ginsberg, to whom nothing rabbinic is difficult or unknown. What others would have spent weeks in searching at his finger ends, and his generosity in coming to fill the rest of the passages of Ha-Ikkarim. Now, as we move forward, there are a lot of people who contributed to this incredible work of Professor Isaac Husik, who published his work in Philadelphia. Like I mentioned, he was a professor in the University of Philadelphia and was published in September of 1929. So we're talking about many years ago. But this work continues to affect the whole entire world, believe it or not. And he says, and Professor Husik makes in his introductory comment, that human happiness depends on the theoretical knowledge and practical conduct, as philosophers explained in the book on the soul. But it's not possible by the human intellect alone to arrive at a proper knowledge in the true and good, because human reason is not capable of comprehending things as they are in reality, as will be explained later. There must be therefore something higher than the human intellect, by means of which good can be defined and true comprehended in a manner leaving no doubts at all. This can be done only by means of divine guidance, and it is incumbent therefore upon every person out of laws to know the one divine law which gives this guidance. This is impossible unless we know the basic principles without which a divine law cannot exist. Accordingly, the purpose of this work is to explain that all the essential principles of divine law, and for this reason it is called the books of principles or fundamentals. The present work consists merely an introduction and the 4 books. An introduction deals with the necessity of a work of this kind, and it outlines in a general way the topic which is proper to investigate therein, and points out to the great importance of the subject under the investigation. It explains this last of the 19th Psalm. In Book 1, and we're going to go with a basically recap of the editor of this work into English, and we're going to go what he summarizes of the entire work of Sefer Ha-Ikkarim, and then we're going to head into the actual work of Sefer Ha-Ikkarim. Book 1 discusses the number of mature and principal laws. It points out to the difference between divine and conventional laws, states the principles of each, it distinguishes between the principle, which are the common to many laws, and those that are peculiar to a given law. And it also shows the reward and punishment. See, this is a very important point, because a lot of people think, for one second, there's no idea of reward and punishment in Judaism, and in fact, they are wrong in that regards. There is. So anyone that tells you there is no such thing in Judaism of reward and punishment need to see the different rabbis of the medieval period, that was a clear teaching within dogmas of Judaism of this period of time. Now, Book 2 discusses the first principle, or the first fundamental teaching, the existence of God and the subordinate principles derived thereupon. Book 3 discusses the second principle, that which is called revelation, and the subordinate principles derived therefrom. In the fourth book, discusses the third principle, reward and punishment, and the subordinate derived therefrom based upon it. Now, as we look at book number 1, which we just covered, we're going to take a look at the principles of laws. It is divided into 26 chapters. So book 1 of Sefer Ha-Ikkarim involves over 26 chapters. In chapter 1 of book 1, it speaks of the difficulty of investigating the principles of law. It is pointed out that these principles are common to all laws and principles peculiar to a given law. Maimonides is criticized for listing the belief in the Messiah as a principle of the laws of Moses. Similarly, are those that are criticized who maintain that the creation of the world is a principle of the law of Moses. Chapter 2 of Book 1 points out that the denial of the principle constitutes heresy, minut, and what denial does not. It points out to neither the belief in the Messiah nor the creation of the world should be regarded as principle of the law of Moses, as many have taught. In other words, Albo does not see that a person does not believe in the belief as the Messiah. They say they deny it, that in fact it does not negate belief in God or in the faith of Judaism. Chapter 3 explains the meaning in terms of principles and discusses the 13 principles of Maimonides in order to determine whether the number is correct or not. So there's a criticism by Albo in Book 1 of the Maimonides principles. It discusses the principles of divine law laid down by others and point out that none of them have the correct number. Chapter 4 of Book 1 explains that the common principles of divine law are 3, which are basic, namely, the existence of God, the revelation of Torah, reward and punishment. Then there are other principles derived from the former and independent upon them. And it's pointed out that 3 of these 3 principles mentioned, and the principles mentioned by Maimonides, are derived from these 3 basic ones. And we're going to look at it, as it pointed out, in the 3 benediction, the ritual of the New Year. And we move forward as we look in chapter 5, explains the necessity of the natural law of existence of human race, pointing out at the same time that the natural law alone is not sufficient for the existence of political society unless there be another law. And it's pointed out that a country must have a judge or a king. And you'll see that in Judaism the idea of law and order becomes prominent. Chapter 6 decides that there must be a divine law to guide mankind to happiness. Chapter 7 explains that the law is natural, conventional, or divine. The meaning and purpose of each are explained in a manner which they are distinguished. Chapter 8 points out to some defects of conventional law and makes it inferior to divine law. It points out also that some of the qualities of divine laws are alluded in the Psalms 19, verse 8 and the following. In chapter 8, we're going to look at, Albo points out some defects of conventional law and makes it inferior to divine law. And it points out that some of the qualities of divine laws are alluded to in Psalms 19. While on chapter 9 of book 1, we're just talking about the first book here. Chapter 9 explains the general principle of conventional law are freedom of the will and of purpose. It also explains why freedom of the will is mentioned in the law of Moses, seeing that it's not a principle of it insofar as it is divine. Chapter 10 of book 1 of Ha-Ikkarim, we're going to look at, it explains the general principles of divine laws are three: existence of God, the reward and punishment, and the revelation of the Torah. And hence they are named as general roots of divine law. And it's pointed out that the rabbis in the Mishnah in the Halik name of all these three. In chapter 11 explains that the study of the law of Moses, we can find out are essential basis of divine law, seeing that all agree that it is divine. Accordingly, we will infer that these three things mentioned are principles of divine law, seeing that they are laid down in the book of Genesis, Bereshit, at the beginning, as the principle of every science are laid down at the beginning of science. It is pointed out that the real beginning of the Torah is the first verse of chapter 5. It explains the meaning of the expression, "Let us make man in our image," chapter 1, verse 26. And that we'll see in the 11th chapter. Chapter 12 explains the reason why Maimonides does not include the dogma of creation in his list of principles, seeing that he regards it as a fundamental in the law of Moses, as he says in the 27th chapter of the second part of the Guide of the Perplexed. In chapter 13, in the book 1 of Ha-Ikkarim, he explains that not every law which acknowledges the three principles mentioned is therefore certainly divine, unless it's acknowledged also that the principle derived from the former, in which case it may be divine. It also points out that to deny a derivative principle is tantamount to denial of the original principle, and thus you may say heresy. Chapter 14 explains that a commandment of the Torah cannot be regarded either as a fundamental or a derivative principle. This is the reason why belief in the tradition is not named as a principle, even though it is essential to the existence of law. And that is in chapter 14 of book 1. And we move forward. The reason is given that the unity of God is regarded as principle, although its particular commandment, it is also explained the principles are not specifically stated in the Ten Commandments. It is maintained that the first commandment is not a principle, as Maimonides says, but a command. Chapter 15 explains the derivative, the principle derived from each of these three original principles. It also explains why we classify them as fundamentals and derivative, and the basic and resultant, and do not regard them all alike as fundamental principles. Now in chapter 16 of Ha-Ikkarim, with a certain topic necessary to divine law, it explains that one of the ancient philosophers thought that it is not possible to acquire knowledge of a thing that is not known. It's explained in the 36 verses of chapter 38 of Job, or Eov, the benediction beginning with the words, "Thou and thy graciousness giveth man knowledge," and the rabbinical expression, "If there is no knowledge, there is no understanding." The Mishnah, Pirkei Avot, chapter 3, 17. This chapter is an introductory to the following chapter 17 of book 1. It explains that every science has a principle and points out the general principles of science. This is done in order to make it clear whence the Torah takes its principles. It explains that verse 136 of Psalms and 119 part of Psalms 78. In chapter 18, Albo explains the difference between the genuine divine law and one that is spurious and pretends to be divine. It also explains the difference between a prophet who is not and a prophet who is a messenger of God for the purpose of giving mankind a law. It also explains the nature of the signs which prove directly the genuineness of the prophecy or mission. It also pointed out that anyone not a prophet who makes use of divine names is punished. In chapter 19, in the first book, Albo gives a definition of belief and shows to what things belief applies and when it is strongest. In chapter 20, he explains why the Torah was not given to Abraham, nor to Isaac, or to Jacob. It also explains the statements of the rabbis in the Talmudic treatise of Avodah Zarah. In the time to come, the Holy One, blessed be He, will take the Torah, put it into His bosom, and say, "Let everyone who is occupied himself with this come and receive his reward." It is also explained why the other nations will not receive a reward for keeping the law which they received by tradition, as the Israelites will receive reward for keeping their tradition. In chapter 21, Albo explains the belief that leads man to eternal happiness, more so than philosophical knowledge, or pointing out that this is verified by experience. On chapter 22, he explains in what things it is that beliefs leads to happiness, pointing out that beliefs in the impossible does not lead to happiness. Also, that the impossible is of two kinds. It explains as how things is known to which belief applies. In Book 1, Chapter 23, Joseph Albo, points out that besides the general belief in the Torah, the commandments are all miracles and are mentioned in the Torah. It is also incumbent to entertain 6 specific beliefs, which are essential for the existence of the Torah at any time, and one who denies any one of them is called a heretic, emenut. In chapter 24, he inquires whether a person professing a given religion is obliged or permitted to investigate the foundations of his religious belief, and the principles derived from them, or whether he must rely on his tradition. So we see all of these elements taking place in the conversation that we will see Albo has with the system of his time, which by and large was the Catholic Inquisition, the Catholic powers that was demanding them to investigate the reliability or the belief in Christianity. In book 1, chapter 25, he investigates whether or not there may be more than one divine law at the same time among different nations or in different countries. Chapter 26, he sums up the book by giving a list of fundamentals and derivative principles essential to divine law as it demands by logical theory, as it is declared in the law of Moses. And here ends the topic of the chapters of the first book. Bezrat Hashem, we will see the next book 2 and summarize it in our next class. I do hope you have enjoyed this segment, which we will begin tomorrow, book 2 in summary of Sefer Ha-Ikkarim. And those of you who would like a copy of the Sefer, it is pretty heavy in its contents, over 482 pages long. So keep in mind, if I send it to you, you need to have the capacity to be able to receive it, or I may go ahead and just upload it on our group page here on the Ways of Israel. And remember, help support the Ways of Israel as we continue teaching Torah and even speaking about our Torah leaders as Joseph Albo. Again, this was done in the memory of George Albo, YEHUDAN, NATAN, of blessed memory. And may Hashem bless every single one as you join in this study with us here on the Ways of Israel. Shalom, shalom.